So now you need to wire up your columns, and those are the vertical runs of wire here that'll connect your columns of key switches for that key switch matrix. I use this pre-tinned wire. I think this is 24 AUG. Yeah, 24 AUG, right? 24 AUG right there. And it's pre-tinned, so once you touch it with solder, the solder will stick to it pretty easily. And what I do is I use red for this first column. I actually just kind of roughly follow the colors of the rainbow, the Roy G. Biv. So I go red, yellow, green, blue, white, black. So that's how I do my columns. And this will actually repeat because there's more than 6 columns. But it helps you later on when you're trying to run your wires in from your controller board. So we've got red installed here. So what I do, next one would be yellow. So I just pull this out here. And I'll actually pull all 6 out at the time and just cut them to roughly the same length. And what you do is you want to run the length and then give yourself about 1 inch of slack. It's easier to cut off a little bit of extra than add to what you can't because it's too short. And then I'll cut off a couple centimeters at the top, and then I'll roughly eyeball this and space it like that for those top 2, and then line it up down here, and it's gonna be a little bit shorter, and I'll show you in a second what we're gonna do here. Do that, and then this is the top again. What I'll do is I'll just pull this jacket and just slide it down, and then slide all these sections down, and I create these gaps in the wire like that. And you can see I've got the 1, 2, 3 for the top 3 contacts and these bottom 2. And then you can lay it in here and see how it lines up. This one lines up, this one lines up. That one's a little too far, so what I'll do is I'll just cut this again right here and slide this down, and then I create a contact point there to solder. So those 3 line up. Down here, this one lines up, and that one, maybe I could cut that and slide a little jacket down, but just because you cut it and move it doesn't mean it's not doing its job. It's keeping it insulated. You can see right there, that's where I actually cut it, but it's nice and solid when you slide it together. So that's pretty much how the column wire installation goes, and you'll just again just repeat the colors and go all the way across. The wiring chart is on the or the wiring diagram is on the Git. You can see the layout there. It's not as intuitive with the way it jumps around, but it's the way that the grid is laid out in the software. Okay, so this is one of the electronics plates wired up. The Pro Micro, I soldered all the wires to it before I mounted it on the plate. Same with the TRS board. And when you install those, you want to make sure you're installing them on the correct board, because those boards are made for the left side and the right side. And if you put all the electronics on one and have to move it to the other, it's a little bit of work to move those wires around the way you have them routed between the reset switch, the TRS port, and that board. So, yep. All right, so you can see I finished wiring all of my columns, and then I've also wired in my controller. You can see where I tie into the columns here, and then these coming in here, you can see where I tie into the rows. You can also see where that color scheme works, just doing it in that order of color. Obviously you can use whatever color code you want, or even use the same color wire for everything, but I found this helps just more clearly see what I'm doing. I fanned out the wires from the controller here. What you can do is pre-wire all these onto the controller, and then when you put this in place, you can lay these down and use a zip tie to dress them in. You've got some pretty short jumpers here. This is a TRRS board. This is the jumper that's going to go between your keyboard halves. I put like 3-inch wires on each one of these, put this in place, and then I shorten them and tie those in there. Same thing with this reset switch here. I'll put a couple 3-inch wires or so. Again, you know, make them a little bit longer than you think you need. It's easier to cut slack off than try to pull something real tight and install it. And then you can't really make it out too much here. There's a wire jumper here going between these 2 pins. This white one kind of buried in here. That's in the diagram on the Git. But that's pretty much how you lay out the wires with the controller. The one thing I'll do just to help make sure that the bottom piece going on here lays up against this is between each hole here, I'll put a small strip of electrical tape. I basically take a length of about 1 foot, or 20 centimeters of electrical tape, and I'll cut it and put 2 slices in it, so I have 3 long strips, and they're real narrow. They're a little more narrow than this, and I'll lay down a piece here and just all the way around, and that helps when I put the base on to ensure if I had a small gap between these two mounting points with the base, it might vibrate there when I'm typing. Just trying to make it a little bit more quiet, and that seems to, it doesn't hurt, that's for sure. And then I'll mount that bottom plate on here. Alright, so next you want to mount your wrist pad bases to the keyboard body, and we're going to do that without having that back on, because you need to be able to access back here to put on the nylock nuts. But I go ahead and I thread these in. I still got to put that one in, but I take them just as far so they barely stick out here, and I'll hold it up against here. And I find using an extension allows me to get a pretty flat angle at those screws, so they don't go in crooked. You want them going straight through this base to go perpendicular straight into the keyboard body. Okay, I got these screwed in. I used washers on the first three. This fourth one, you can't fit a washer on there. And this one just actually self-taps, and I think this one's a 12mm. The rest of these are all 20. And I put washers. Again, the hardware list is in the Git page. And then I've got the nylock nuts. I used washers on these two. This one you can't fit a washer because that space is kind of tight there. And then this other one is just, you can see the hole there where it self-taps. And this is what it looks like when you have the base on it. I've got the screw lengths on the Git page. I also put holes. I put recessed holes in there for rubber feet. There's what it looks like with the keycaps installed on that side. This one you can see I already got this put together. The next step here is to wrap the base piece. I'm going to sand it first and wrap it in 3M car wrap and then get it installed on there. And that'll be next. One of the things I like to do before wrapping the wrist rest with the 3M vinyl material is sand it down a little bit. Just you're basically knocking off those print lines, because this will actually show through if you press down on that 3M vinyl firmly. You'll start seeing these lines come through and you'll see a texture. But if you flatten it by just kind of cutting those top edges with a sanding block, I used 80 grit. You barely have to make a few passes and it'll knock down the edges. Just go over that with a bit of sandpaper and you'll get a smoother finish when you put that 3M vinyl down. And then as you use it, as time goes on, you're not going to start seeing this texture show up. I had that with one of my older builds, but I found that sanding it makes a huge difference. So definitely worth taking a few minutes of time to sand that flat before wrapping it with your vinyl. Alright, so now that you have your wrist rests prepped, you may have to drill out these holes depending on how the supports are removed. If they fill in those holes at all, you're going to want to clean those out so you can get your bolts put through. And once you have this sanded, clean off all the dust and whatnot, get ready to put your vinyl on. You're going to cut your vinyl out, give yourself about 1 inch at least around the edge, because you're going to wrap it around it and you want a little bit of a lip there to work with to pull it up. And I've got some pictures on the Git page as well about mounting this stuff. Alright, so this is the end result of wrapping it at least and getting this lip put on. You'll kind of find your tricks on how you're going to stretch this around these corners, but this has always been a problem, and this actually turned out really good. I just pulled it without using a heat gun. It's warm in my office here. It's about 75 degrees because I got my computer running and a few other things. But this is what it looks like. The next thing I'm going to do is these high points. Some of those, hit them with a heat gun and you can flatten this really well. You can see like here, there's a little flap of material there. I'll probably trim the top of that off, but it's pulled into position pretty good and it's anchored by a lot of material here. But you can see other than that, this one turned out nice. So there you go, just repeat with the other side. Alright, so this is the result of cleaning up these edges. And you can see here the texture showing through. I basically heated up these edges pretty decently and then just pressed it in there to make sure it's adhering to as much surface as it can so it stays stuck. But that cleaned up nicely, and I'm going to go ahead and get this mounted in place here just like that. Alright, so we've got the pad installed there and it's secured with screws through the bottom of the keyboard there. And so that looks good. The other thing I wanted to point out, I want to talk a little more about is the keycaps. One, the spacebars are actually shift keys from WASD keycaps. It's hard to find the correct width in a lot of keycap sets, so you have to kind of go out there and get those on their own for the spacebars, but they're really comfortable to type on because they slope down with the way your thumb lays on the keycap. So those are pretty comfortable. The other thing I want to talk about is the keycaps. When you got to pull them off of the keyboard, you want to hold the key switch in place if possible, because those keycaps can have a really good grab on that stem, and if you pull the keycap straight up, you might actually rip the key switch out of the board. Remember, those are friction fit, so some kind of some kind of screwdriver or something to hold that key switch in place when you pull the key switch would probably be a pretty good move. Some keycaps may come up just fine without grabbing the stem too securely, but just in case, you want to hold that key switch in place when you're pulling the keycaps to remove them. Okay, so now that you have your physical